finale of what's been a wonderful day of learning and development at the Institute. Just quickly, on the Institute of Managers and Leaders, for 80 years, we have been creating better managers and better leaders for a better society. The Institute does this through practical learning and development. We've got 3 wonderful leadership programs: Essentials, Foundations and Accelerate, all of which are facilitated by Shannon Cooper as one of our lead facilitators. We also put on days like today. We do fortnightly webinars, fortnightly masterclasses. We've got a mentoring program, lots and lots of member events where there's networking opportunities, and some wonderful resources to help you become a better manager and leader, both in your professional space, but also personally in your personal life. As I said, today's event has been wonderful. I will acknowledge some people at the end of today's session who have been behind setting it all up and have done a wonderful job. We've had 4 of Australia and New Zealand's leading facilitators today sharing their insights on resilience, and it's been a wonderful session. I also wanted to highlight Shannon's work at lunchtime with the lunchtime networking session. Shannon ran that expertly, brought to the fore some great ideas and allowed people to connect. So thank you very much for Shannon for that. I also ask that you've all got your action plans in front of you for today, what you're going to start, what you're going to stop, what you're going to continue, and some of those great learning outcomes that Shannon will run through with you shortly, so that you take away some practical insights and information that you can then practice in your own workplace. I also wanted to say that any inquiries from today's virtual development day into any of our programs, in-house consulting work, if you'd like to hear more from people like Shannon and the great facilitators we've had today, please email us at info@managersandleaders.com.au. And also on social media, we've been everywhere. #development day. #IML Development Day. I think we've been trending somewhere, so I'm very excited for that. So thank you to those who've shared it on social media. It makes a big impression for the Institute ourselves, and as I said, the ultimate aim for us is that you take away something really practical, and that you can then use as an outcome in your own workplace and for yourself. Now on to our last session, and Shannon told me I want to drop a bomb on resilience, and I want to talk about anti-fragility, and I couldn't even pronounce the word when he sent it through, but I've got it now, and he certainly wants to share some new ideas, some new thinking around this terminology. So in introducing the topic, we certainly live in uncertain times. COVID has certainly changed the routine for virtually everyone around the globe. The question now is, what will the future be? In this session that Shannon is going to present to us, we don't intend to answer that question, but instead want to explore a few possibilities, and not just for your organisation, but for your personal life as well. Using the concept of anti-fragility, we want to look at a couple of things. What is anti-fragility? And I want to know that personally as well. The illusion of predictability in a world of black swans and grey rhinos. I don't know where you're going with this, Shannon, and then also 5 ways for you and your team to develop an anti-fragile mindset. Cool. So I'm really looking forward to this session. It's going to be a wonderful conclusion to today's fantastic development day. And to introduce Shannon, as I said, he's been a lead facilitator for IML since the very beginning of our leadership programs, Essentials, Foundations, Accelerate. He does the lot, and he also consults extensively for IML's corporate clients and does a wonderful job. The feedback is always phenomenal. Shannon started his career as a chemical engineer. He left the lab 15 years ago when he discovered that blending logic and inspiration could add up to some pretty powerful business ideas and business outcomes for people. And I'm delighted to say, as I said, Shannon does an enormous amount of work for us, but delighted to welcome you, Shannon. It's over to you.
Thank you, Sam. It sounds like we're going to go for a trip to the zoo, doesn't it? Or a virtual zoo, yeah. Of course.
I don't know what we're going to do. Looking forward to it.
Thank you, mate. Thank you. Always generous in your introductions. Thank you so much. What an awesome day it's been. I'm not really sure whether this is for you listening in, whether this is your first session of the development day or your fourth session, but wow, it's just been extraordinary. And Matt Byrne just before me, always a delight. I could sit and listen to Matt Vox Pop about leadership and management all day. I always take something new from what Matt has to share. But this is our final session of our September 2020 IML Development Day, and I'm speaking to you, or coming to you directly from Melbourne. And if you're from Melbourne, you know what all kinds of crazy fun that is for us here in suburban Melbourne right now in the middle of lockdown. But wherever you are today, I hope that you are safe and well. So as Sam said, today I'm going to talk about anti-fragility. Now this is a concept that I think is really relevant to today, because anti-fragility talks directly to how we react to external disruption and how we are able to transform ourselves and our business and you'll see this as I go through. The concept itself, I don't think is necessarily anything new. It's been around forever. It's certainly been around in nature, in business, even in our own sort of personal lives. It's something that's been around forever. But it's probably, so even though we've experienced it, it probably wasn't until about 2012 when a gentleman by the name of Nassim Taleb came along and coined this term anti-fragility or anti-fragile, and sort of gave a name to something that we've all experienced. And Nassim has gone on, and he's a best-selling author. He's got multiple books. He's kind of all over the place at the moment, and he really is the inspiration for this presentation, the session that I'm going to deliver for you this afternoon. So let's have a little bit of a look at our agenda and where we're going to go. We're going to start off by having a little bit of talk about the future and future scenarios. A lot of people at the moment in our news, certainly in our boardrooms, the sessions that I deliver at all levels, the consulting work that I do, even at our networking events with IML, people are often asking, what's the future going to look like? What's the future going to look like? How do we prepare for the future? So our first stop this afternoon is going to be to have a bit of a conversation about the future. Then we're going to have a bit of a talk to you, as Sam said. We're going to talk a little bit, going to go a bit animalia. We're going to talk about black swans and grey rhinos. Again, a couple of terms that you may have heard used a lot in recent times. So we're going to put the spotlight on what both those things are, beyond just being a black swan and a grey rhino. What's the metaphor that they are trying to reveal to us? So we're going to have a bit of a conversation around that as well. Then we're going to talk about the illusion of predictability. I think there's this, again, a lot of people out there trying to suggest that they know what is going to happen in the future, and I think that that's problematic. I think that that's yeah, a bit of a sucker's game to a certain degree. So I'm going to share a little bit why I think that very soon, and then we're going to define what anti-fragility is. So we'll have a bit of a conversation about Nassim Taleb's concept of anti-fragility, put it under the microscope, and try to, in as much detail as we can, help you understand exactly what we mean by anti-fragility. And then we're going to round out, as you'll know if you've ever been to any of my workshops, webinars, sessions, you'll know that it's always about the application, right? Concepts are interesting, but what do we do with them? So we're going to talk about 5 key principles that you can use to develop an anti-fragile mindset, whether it be personally or within your business. And as always, we'll round out with some Q&A towards the end. So throughout the session, if there are any key questions that bob up for you, anything that you want to ask, please don't hesitate to pop them into the chat box, so that when we get towards the end of today's session, we'll try to answer as many of those as we can, or at least just discuss them and pull them apart a little bit. Might not have all of the answers, but at least we can have a bit of discussion and try and edge closer towards an answer or a satisfactory response. So feel free to type away and knock yourself out in that chat box. So let's first of all, let's start with the future. It's interesting, actually, if you're on our first session this morning with Nikki, Nikki mentioned that for her and her family, 2020 was going to be the year of the bucket list. She had a whole stack of things that she was going to achieve this year and had set a path to enable her to achieve that. But yeah, things didn't really pan out that way because, well, let's be honest, 2020 contained a whole stack of things, events, incidents, barriers and obstacles and challenges that not only Nikki, but the rest of us didn't really expect. right? Now, of course, the great news for Nikki is that worked out well for her, and she was able to take those things in her stride. I'd almost suggest that Nikki is a great example of anti-fragility, and you'll see why very soon. But I think this highlights the point, right? At the moment, we live in this time, or this moment of uncertainty. This worldwide pandemic has literally changed the routine of everyone around the globe. And it's almost like the $1 million question right now is, well, what will the future be? We keep hearing this term. We've heard it today, and I use it. It's the new normal. What will the new normal look like? Even in today's press here in Melbourne, it's talking about, what will the future look like? And of course, that means for us here in Melbourne, when can we go to the footy? How many people can go to the footy? And we will have to wear face masks at the footy. So that's typically what it means here in Melbourne. But there's all these conversations about what will the future look like. And I think that sometimes as human beings, I reckon that sometimes we're a little bit too obsessed with the future. We always seem to be in search of trying to develop a sense of certainty about what's going to happen next, right? We really want to know what's going to happen, when it's going to happen. So it's no surprise that given that us humans have this kind of fascination, that there's all these sort of professionals out there looking at the future. From risk analysis to futurists, all the way through to fortune tellers and gypsies and astrologists, right? And of course, why not? They're all aimed at kind of answering those questions that we have about the future. What's going to happen? When's it going to happen? What are the lotto numbers? Whatever it might be. But can we really predict what's going to happen in the future? Can we really know for sure? Is it really possible to kind of understand what's going to happen in the future? Was it possible or foreseeable that we should have predicted COVID-19, for example? Well, I want to ask you a question, right? I want to ask you a question. And I want you to think about this, and I want you to write your answer down into the chat box, right? There's no right or wrong to this. Those often hear that cliche, no right or wrong. I just want you to write down the answer in the chat box. So here we go. The question is, if someone could tell you exactly how and when you were going to die, would you want to know? If someone could tell you exactly how and when you were going to die, would you want to know? And all I want you to do is type the word yes or no into the chat box. Yes or no into the chat box. Beautiful. Some results coming in. Thank you, folks. Yeah, real mix there. Yeah, cool. Yes or no? Interesting, right? So here's what happened, right? This question was actually asked for real by the American Psychological Association. They went out and asked a stack of people this very same question. And what they found was that 87%, nearly 9 out of 10, which is fairly analogous to the results we've got here today, right? 87% of people said, hell no, no way. We don't want to know for sure anything about the future, whether it's big things like the cause of death or it's the little things like who's going to win the football this weekend. We don't want to know, right? People don't want to know. And I think that this is interesting, right? So this is weird. We've got this obsession for the future, but when pressed, we actually turn around and say, well, actually, we don't really want to know too much about the future. And I think this is interesting, right? I think this is really interesting because, it's almost like a bit of a dichotomy, a bit of a paradox. And I've thought about this for a while because in part of the work that I do is heavily geared towards creativity and innovation. Of course, helping businesses and organisations and leaders become more adaptive towards the future. So, of course, linked in with that is, well, what does the future look like? But I've always found it weird that people don't want to know what the future looks like on one hand, but on the other hand, they do. What's going on? And Jane McGonigal, if you've never heard of Jane, you can look her up. She is a futurist. That's the title that she uses. She's got some amazing books, amazing TED Talks. Speaks at conferences. A real bundle of energy and wonderful insight. And I remember seeing her speak once, and she had this quote, and I've shared it with you on the screen here. She said that if you're able to predict the future correctly, so even let's say that we're able to look into that crystal ball and predict the future, well, now what? You're stuck. We're sitting here in the present, waiting for the future that we've predicted to happen to us, right? We're powerless. right? Because we know what's going to happen, so we're stuck. All we can do is try to prepare ourselves for the future in the way that it's going to play out, right? So I think what she really means here is that rather than chasing after exactly what the future will be, it's actually smarter and more appropriate to imagine possible scenarios, right? And to try to work towards creating the future that you want, rather than buckling up and just charting towards the future that's going to happen, okay? And really, when I talk about trying to predict the future, and the programs that we do here at IML, particularly our Accelerate program, that's exactly what we do. We don't try to predict the future. We don't equip our participants with tools to necessarily predict the future, but it's about imagining possible scenarios. But more importantly, helping them through their leadership and their organisations, as a result of their leadership, drive towards the future that they really want. So if we can take that space for a while, right? If we can say it's not about predicting the future, but it's about imagining possible scenarios and trying to create the future that you want. I want to show you two types of future events that we can use to try to imagine potential future scenarios, right? If we want to imagine them, what's the framework? What's the tool? What's the practical approach that we can use? Now, you may have heard of them because they've been buzzwords. They've been around for a while, but they've particularly come to the fore in the last little while since COVID has enveloped the world. And they are the terms of black swan and grey rhino, right? Two types of futures, the black swan one and the grey rhino one. Now, they are two different concepts that we can use to try to think about and imagine the future. Right? So let's have a look at the first one. The first one is the black swan. Now, the black swan, as I said, it's been mentioned a lot lately, particularly in relation to COVID-19. You type into Google, COVID-19, coronavirus, black swan, watch Google explode, right? It just goes nuts. Now, if you haven't heard of this metaphor before, it's something that the black swan is a metaphor based on this kind of historical presumption, pretty much from the 17th century, that all swans are white, right? There was a belief in what we might call modern society that all swans were white because all the historical records up until that point in time about swans had them as white, right? They had white feathers, right? So in that context, a black swan was impossible, or at the very least non-existent. They didn't consider that it might just be something that they haven't discovered yet. The belief was that swans are white. No one envisaged a black swan. And it wasn't until, I had to write it down here so I remember, 1697, right, when there was some Dutch explorers frolicking around the western side of Australia. Hello to all those over in WA at the moment. Hope you're enjoying your freedom. But there were some Dutch explorers around your space of the world in the late 1600s, and they discovered, of course, black swans. So something that they thought was impossible, something that was non-existent, all of a sudden happened, right? And that's where this metaphor comes from, right? This term is used as a metaphor for something, or to sort of, annote the idea that something that we thought was impossible might later become disproven. And when that happens, we call it a black swan event. When something that we thought was impossible or non-existent or couldn't possibly occur happens, black swan, right? Now, Nassim Taleb, who I mentioned earlier, right? So he's the author of Antifragility, but before Antifragility, he wrote this book called The Black Swan. And he says that a black swan event, his sort of determination or definition of a black swan event, is something that is very unlikely, unpredictable, but has a very large destructive event. Right? So he kind of took the metaphor and kind of expanded upon it. So yeah, it is something that's pretty unlikely, it's unpredictable, but when it does happen, it has a large destructive effect, usually on a global scale. All right. Now, so if we can sit with that for a moment, right? This idea that a black swan is something that happens outside of the normal expectations, because nothing in the past could have conceivably prepared us for the experience that we're having, right? Nothing even really pointed to its possibility. It happened and we weren't prepared for it. There's nothing that could have happened that could have even imagined that this could have happened or happened to this particular scale. or it's a situation that's happened where there is no historical precedent that we can kind of use to add as a set of framing or a set of context for us, yeah? So what he's basically saying is that there are events that occur that us humans can't possibly imagine or haven't yet imagined. We've never lived through them, so we've got no context for it, right? So we just don't have the information in our minds to be able to think about it, you know? So these things are just unpredictable. Right. So, you know, in broad terms, he kind of says this: it's an outlier because nothing in the past can conceivably point to its possibility. So let's look at some examples of some of the things that we might consider as black swan events. Now, again, these are open to interpretation, right? Often with a black swan event, some people will say, well, no, that's not a black swan event. Some people will say, well, yes, it is a black swan event. So I want to present some to you, you know, as what I think we could argue or create an argument that are black swan events, but I'm also very open to the idea that you might say, well, maybe not. Right? So the first one that I want to share with you was the 9/11 attack on the Twin Towers in the USA. Right? You think about this, no one really thought, particularly at that time, no one thought that this could possibly happen. This was completely unexpected, and it did a lot of damage, you know, societal damage, economic damage, you know, just, yeah, significant damage right across the world. The ripples of this attack were felt right across the world for many, many years. And in fact, this event still resonates for us because it was so unexpected. And even just having this image here, I'm always worried about or challenged or concerned or anxious about sharing images like this because you just don't know what type of emotional response it might provoke people, because it was unexpected, and that sort of made it even more shocking. Right? Or another example might be to think about the dot-com crash of 2001. Right? So you think about this, at that time, America was enjoying rapid economic growth. There was massive increases in wealth, and the economy was going gangbusters, and then it catastrophically collapsed quickly on the back of this dot-com boom. And part of the reason why, when we sort of look back and look at the forensics of it, and of course it's more detailed than this, but let's just think in simple terms, right? That the internet was really at its infancy back then, you know, that early 2000s. It's kind of grown, but still at its infancy in terms of its commercial use, right? And how businesses could survive and prosper and grow through the internet, or how we could create a commercially sustainable business model using the internet as a key pillar. Right, so there's all these investment funds investing in technology, hand over fist, you know, punching each other out of the way to invest in these companies. And that led to all of these inflated valuations, right? And no real market traction other than just these inflated valuations. And of course, then what happened? That bubble burst, and these companies folded. The funds were hit hard, and the downside of the risk was passed on to the investors, right? And I think what happened was, and the reason that not just I, but others consider this to be a black swan event, is because at that time the digital frontier was so new that it was nearly impossible to predict the collapse that was going to happen, right? There was nothing like throughout history that we'd experienced like that before to be able to potentially predict that. And as I said, even, you know, hindsight's a wonderful thing, right? We can look back and go, well, you should have seen it coming. But the reality was, we didn't. Right? There was clever people investing in these businesses. These weren't idiots. They weren't fools. They weren't all sort of renegades and mavericks. These were clever people, right? Some very risk-averse people investing in these funds. But it happened, and we didn't predict it because we hadn't imagined that it could even occur. Well, perhaps another one, you know, the Titanic, right? We all know the story. The ship that was built with the state-of-the-art technology, particularly for the time, you know, theoretically it was sink-proof. It was the unsinkable ship and sunk on its first voyage. Totally unexpected. Even when you watch the movie, right? You watch the James Cameron movie from, what was it, 20 years ago? Something like that, yeah? You watch the movie and it's like, oh, it's like, how could this possibly sink? I don't know how many times I've seen that movie, and I've always, like, it's unexpected that it sinks. And of course, we just want, what's the guy's name? Jack and Rose? We just want them to live happily ever after. It sunk, totally unexpected. So these are black swan events, things that were kind of unpredictable, things that we never imagined but happen. Then, Sam, you'll be pleased to know, as I said, I mentioned grey rhinos as well. So let's have a bit of a chat about grey rhinos. So on the other hand, right, is this grey rhino. And this term was developed by a guy called, coined by a lady, I should say, Michelle Wacker. And Michelle specialises in sort of economics and crisis anticipation, and wrote this book called The Grey Rhino. So the metaphor for a grey rhino is that something that it's big, it's obvious, and it poses a very real threat to us, but we tend to ignore it. Right, so you imagine, there's a rhino. So the metaphor is that there's a rhino, and it's big and it's grey and it poses a threat. But what we then do is ignore it. I'm not really sure that you'd ignore a rhino if you sort of were walking around the paddock somewhere, or walking around the outback somewhere, and you saw a loose rhino. You'd probably react. But that's the metaphor anyway. Right, because it kind of goes that a grey rhino, it's pretty common, it's pretty large, it's impossible to ignore, but we sometimes do. Right, and we know that if one comes to get us and attacks us in any way, then it's probably very likely that we're going to get hurt. So let's have a look at some examples of some of the things that we might consider to be grey rhinos. The first one is global warming. Right, now it's something that's there. Right, we all see it. We know it's there. We've heard about it. We may all not agree to the level of significance of it, or the level of impact, or the science behind it. There's lots of varying views. I'm not sort of saying that I'm sitting here in a position saying it's absolute, or I buy into all the science. That's not what it's about, because I think even the detractors agree that there is a change in our environment happening. It's just to what extent, right? But because it's certainly something that people are talking about. And because it's so out there, right, and it's occupying so much conversations, for most of us, we kind of go, well, someone must be doing something about it, right? Because it seems to be pretty significant. So it's a threat. Surely someone's dealing with this at some level, right? Maybe not. We don't know for sure. But the key is it's something that is there that could have a significant impact on us. I suppose another example, another sort of very real example, is the bushfires that engulfed Australia earlier this year. Right, now these were terrible, catastrophic. Estimated, what was it, sort of 18.6 million hectares of land. Nearly 6,000 buildings were destroyed. 35 people tragically lost their lives in these bushfires. Right, and then there was not only in those areas of the bushfires, but of course air quality was significantly impacted pretty much right across Australia, particularly in the southern and eastern states. Right now, and, you read the press now, and economists say that it's probably going to cost over $103 billion in property damage and economic losses. Right, the bushfires alone, don't know, that makes it one of Australia's most significant and expensive natural disaster. Now, of course, during the fires, and particularly during the aftermath, there has been a lot of discussion and a lot of debate. Many people, experts, clever people, right, say that these bushfires were a predictable event and that we should have seen it coming. Not only that, but we should have been better prepared for it. But we should have had better precautions in place. And we should have not only been able to reduce the likelihood of occurring, but the impact of it when it did occur. Right? But we didn't. So for some people, this was a grey rhino event. Right? So we've got the grey rhinos and we've got the black swan. So the million-dollar question is, COVID-19, is it a black swan or is it a grey rhino? Right? Now, some people, and perhaps you do, think it's a black swan. They go, well, look, there's nothing that we could have done to prevent this. We could not have potentially even predicted that an epidemic like this was going to sweep the world and have such a significant impact. It's just unfathomable to us, right? Now, of course, what happens, of course, some of our government officials tend to think that. Right? They'd like us to think that we could never have predicted this, so that's why we weren't so ready. And I think that there are some business leaders and managers who also would like to think that, or like to lean on the side that COVID-19 is a black swan. Well, I never would have predicted this happening, and that's why we're not prepared. Perhaps, I don't know. Right? But of course, some say it's a grey rhino. Right? They say that the COVID-19 isn't a black swan, but it's actually a grey rhino. There's plenty of evidence out there that a pandemic could happen and is likely to happen, right? Including Nasib Taleb, who wrote the book, right? He wrote the book, The Black Swan, and he says that COVID-19 isn't a black swan event, but a grey rhino event. Right, a very recent interview that I was listening to him, and he was getting very agitated that people were using the term black swan to describe COVID-19, because he said, no, it doesn't work like that. He says that the medical community already knew and anticipated that a significant virus could have an impact on a global scale. Even scholars in this area say that we should have been better prepared. And without sort of going down a bit of sailing close to a conspiracy line, because there's plenty of those out there at the moment as well. But if you watch even Bill Gates in 2015, of course, in his talk that's gathered a lot of discussion lately, he said that the main vulnerability of the human population is a likely epidemic, right? And we're just simply not prepared for it. And that was in 2015. So again, I'm not sort of saying is it one or the other. I just think that it's provocative, right? But I also think that there's something weird, something interesting, right, when you start to think about this, because we've all seen the documentaries about the end of humanity, right? This is nothing new for anyone. That's what I think. I kind of agree. Maybe it's not a black swan, because we did imagine this, but we've seen it in art, in science fiction, right? If you ever watch the Doomsday series on the History Channel, 10 ways that the world could end. One of them, or anything similar, right? One of them is always a virus outbreak. Whenever the world's going to end, there's always a scenario that's about a virus outbreak, and then we got the zombies, of course, and even the zombies in the movies, it usually starts, those zombies apocalypses, they always start with a virus outbreak. At the beginning of everything is always a virus, right? Therefore, it's not as though this is so weird and outside of our area of imagination that we've never imagined or never concocted a future where this could potentially happen. So you might argue from that perspective, maybe this isn't a black swan, but in fact, it's a rhino. But we could also say that maybe that's a moot point, because this is what I think happens, right? Is that if we think about this, even though if we say it's a grey rhino, right, and we say that we have been predicting the future, both in science and art, where there could be a virus that has a significant impact on humanity, it's not such an unthinkable event, because we did think about it, right? And they say, don't want to be the judge here, but and I don't want to sort of get caught into the debate, but I think one of the things that both sides agree on, whether we think about COVID-19 as a black swan or a grey rhino, both sides agree that there was absolutely no way of knowing for sure exactly where, when, and how the pandemic was going to happen. Right, so the black swan side say we never predicted it, and even the grey rhino people said we should have predicted it, but they agree that, yep, it was coming, but we've got no way of actually knowing when, where, and how significant it would happen. So in a way, and I'm sorry for this slide, I hope it's not hurting your eyes, don't fall asleep on me. It's kind of weird, isn't it? Is it going in, is it going out, what's going on? Turn to one side if you need to, or blink or something, if that's this slide's hurting your eyes, right? But here's the thing, right? Predictability, in this way, we could say that predictability is an illusion, right? We're never able to predict an exact future. We are never able to predict exactly when and where things are going to happen. And the reason why this happens is because life is not a linear equation, right? So when we talk about creating future scenarios, we sort of operate in this weird space where we're not working in a place of absolute what's going to happen. What we try to do is anticipate what could happen and develop plans around them, because it's impossible to know the exact panorama of how things might play out. Right? But we want to believe there is a formula for predicting the future, don't we? We want to believe that there is some kind of method that we can use to try to predict the future so that we know exactly what it is that we need to do, where we should invest our money, what's the better way forward, what strategy should we devise. But it's an illusion, folks. It's an illusion. Life is not a linear equation. You remember these from, I don't know, grade 5 or something like that? Y equals mx plus c, the old linear equation, right? Life is not like that, right? Where y is a function of x that's completely predictable, where things happen depending according to a formula, right? In this graph here, there is no surprise. But of course, in reality, that's not how it works. Right? That's not how it works. Now, in hindsight, of course, we look back and we think that things were linear. We look back and we go, well, yeah, cause and effect, and there was a sequence of events. Yeah, that was going to happen. Yeah, well, was there any surprise that was going to happen? But of course, when we look forward, it's not exactly like that. Let me give you a couple of examples. Let's think about medicine, and this sort of comes from Nassim Taleb's book, right? So I want you to imagine this, right? When you have some medicine, it has an impact on your body. And every day when you take some medicine, you'll get some benefit. You take one pill, right? You get some benefit, right? And if you double its quantity, say you took 2 pills instead of 1, that doesn't mean that you're going to double the effect of that medication, right? It's not going to happen like that, because there's other variables at play, other variables of your health, your immune system, genetics, whatever, right? That doesn't just mean take 2 pills, get better faster, or my health improves 2 times faster. It's not a linear type situation. In fact, you take 2 pills, you might get 5 times the benefit, or you might get 1.5 times, or you might get half the benefit, right? It varies from person to person, and it's not always easily predicted. If we think of it from a business perspective, right? From a business perspective, you say you've got a profitable business, right? You've got a profitable business where things are working efficiently and effectively, your team is productive. So you decide that you're going to double the number of people who work in your organisation. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to make twice the money, or that you're going to be twice as efficient and twice as profitable. And we know that because it's not something that's linear. We don't know for sure the impact that that's going to happen. There's different patterns, different influences, different factors at play, and also an element of randomness. Right? So, yeah, life's not a linear equation. And one of the models that I just want to quickly sort of touch on, and this is called the Cynefin framework. And we talk about this in many of our programs. And this was developed by a guy called David Snowden. It's called the Cynefin. And if you see the on the left, you're going, what, Cynefin? It says Cynefin, Shannon, what's going on? But it's actually pronounced K with a K, Niven with a V, Cynefin, and it's a Welsh word meaning habitat, haunt, something that's familiar. And Snowden uses this term to say that we all have sort of these different types of connections, and we work in these different types of environments. And understanding the environment where we work can help us make decisions. And the Cynefin framework talks about 4 different habitats: the simple habitat, which is down on the bottom right-hand side of the image that you're looking at, what we call the complicated environment, top right-hand side, across to the complex and the chaotic. And again, I'm not going to go through all of these just because of the level of time that we have today, and you'll get a copy of the slides, but this is a useful way of trying to think about future scenarios and ascertain whether or not the judgments you are making in the here and the now are consistent with where you are currently at and where the future might be. But it also provides us a bit of a framework or a formula for thinking about, okay, well, if things change, how might I best deal with that? If this scenario happens, how might I deal with that? If this scenario happens, how might I deal with that? So we kind of get a bit of a framework in this Cynefin framework. Again, really fascinating model. I know that in the past, IML, we've done some webinars on this particular topic, but something I'd encourage you to sort of explore. But I think Cynefin, black swan, grey rhino, the key question is, how can we live in this world of uncertainty? With everything that we've said so far, that's kind of where we get to, right? How do we do this? How do we even walk forward? How do we guide our organisations forward when we don't know where the hell we're going? How do we live in this world of uncertainty? It's scary enough, and now you're scaring us even more, right? Well, this is where this term anti-fragile comes in. Right? Antifragile, again, a book written by Nassim Taleb, and he talks about antifragility as being something that exists the other side of resilience or robustness. Right? So it's kind of like the opposite of fragile. Antifragile, opposite of fragile. Right? Everyone knows what a fragile thing is, right? Something that breaks or is damaged in some way when it's struck by a force or the equilibrium is disrupted. So imagine what the opposite of that looks like, right? Anti-fragile things are things that gain from disorder, right? As the cover of the book that you can see in the image says there, these are things that get better when they are faced with a disruption or a shock or some type of outside threat. Now, this might seem a little bit counterintuitive. You're like, what? This doesn't make sense. My head is hurting. It's late in the day, particularly for our New Zealand colleagues, right? How could something get better when it's broken? Well, how can something get better when it's disrupted? Well, let me give you a little bit more of a detail of this concept. So on the left-hand side, we have things that are fragile. So fragile things are things that are easily damaged through disorder. Right? For example, a mug falls off a desk. Right? A mug falls off a desk and falls onto a tiled floor, it's going to break when it encounters that disorder for however it falls off the desk. And then we have something that's resilient. And we've heard a lot about resilience today, wonderful stuff about resilience. And this is not a dissing of resilience in any way. But of course, what it is, it's about how do we actually cope with the disorder and the change? Because we're going to be infected in some way, but how do we remain intact? How do we remain, at our peak level of performance? That's what resilience is all about. Now, wonderful speakers, particularly Nikki and Ty this morning, spoke wonderfully about some strategies that we can use to do just that. But anti-fragility is about how do we benefit from the disorder? How do we suffer the impact and then not only not get negatively affected, but manage to transcend that shock and grow or morph into something that's even better? Hard to imagine, right? Let me give you a concrete example. Let me keep going. Think about a candle, right? When the wind blows, imagine a candle. When the wind blows, it goes out. It's something that's fragile. But let's think about that in a business context, right? So, what does that look like? You might go, oh, my business is not a candle, right? But what does it look like from a business sense? So a couple of preconditions. The first one is that fragile things, and this is all according to Nasib Taleb, right? Fragile things are typically large. And what happens is that size, right? So size of a business, size of a team, even market share size, whatever it might be for you, size, big size, often offers a false sense of security. Right? Large organisations, giant organisations, and even big governments some way, typically aren't agile enough to survive to significant shocks. Huh? And let alone survive during sustained periods of adversity, simply because there are too many complications, too many layers of bureaucracy to allow for the quick action that needs to happen. And of course, we're seeing evidence of that right across the world right now, very tragically. A lot of people are being displaced, jobs being lost, businesses folding, big businesses, significant business been around for decades, hundreds of years in some cases, and literally not going to survive. But they were big, and we go, how did that happen? Right? A bit like the Titanic, right? Think about the Titanic, big, huge, how could it possibly sink, got all this state-of-the-art tech? But the reality was that by the time the people in the lookout spotted the iceberg, it was too late to relay that message back to the people that needed to tell the people to tell the captain to turn the wheel so that we could take the corrective action that needed to happen. Right? And even when it did manage to turn, its turning speed and radius was so slow and so big that it hit the iceberg. It was too big to react. Right? So, this is one of the other things, right? So the other thing that often happens for fragile things is that they rely upon responses to stress which come from the outside. Right? So if something is fragile, for example, it can sit there beautifully. Again, a bit like that teacup or that mug on the desk. It can sit there forever. And provided nothing happens, it will be absolutely fine. But at the end of the day, if it does fall off the desk, there is nothing to help fender off that stress. Right? So the stress might come from something external. Someone knocks the desk or someone moves their hand and the mug falls off. And what happens then is that unless you're quick enough with your reflexes to catch it, or whether there's a soft falling, that thing is going to break. In other words, once that mug is disrupted and it's in a state of falling, it's going to break unless something saves it. Right? And that's one of the aspects of fragility. That mug is going to fall. That candle is going to blow out unless someone quickly somehow stops that breeze from hitting that candle and blowing it out. Now, as I said, this works. That candle will keep doing, that mug will keep mugging if everything goes to plan. But rarely does everything go to plan. Randomness is a rule. Right? Randomness happens. The other thing that happens with fragile things is that they're overly optimized, right? Fragile businesses, people and organizations, let's be honest, sometimes we're too smart for our own good, right? Our modern world, particularly our organizations, are obsessed with efficiency and optimization. Businesses, we just want to crank out as many widgets as we can, as quickly as we can, efficiently, and as at a lower cost as we possibly can. And even individuals, we often schedule our days so tightly that there is no latitude for anything. Right? And again, when our days go to plan, that's beautiful. But when there is one little interruption, the whole thing goes to pot pretty quickly. Right? And we've all got our own situations and scenarios linked in with that. So these are some of the hallmarks. And again, when I talk about the mindsets very quickly, I'll talk in a little bit more detail about how to overcome these. But then we've got, again, resilience. And we've heard a lot about resilience today, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. But if we just go back to the idea of a candle, if the candle is fragile because it's going to get blown out, we might say that a lantern is a more resilient structure, right? Because when the wind blows, the glass in the case keeps the candle or the fire from blowing out, right? So in broader terms, resilient people, resilient businesses, they don't really care if the circumstances become volatile or disruptive up to a point, because they can remain steady and optimized during that particular time. Okay. So then we've got the anti-fragile, and anti-fragility is about things that grow from volatility and stress, right? So think about this, and I've got a fire here, right? So a fire we might describe as being anti-fragile, because when the wind blows, so that same disruption that happened to the candle, the same disruption happened to the lantern, what happens to the fire is that it gets bigger, it becomes more ferocious. The fire feeds off the oxygen and it grows. It doesn't go up, it doesn't stay the same, it changes and it gets bigger, right? That's anti-fragile, things that grow and strengthen from volatility and stress. Right? And when people and systems are anti-fragile, there's more upside than downside, even when black swan events occur, yeah? Right? They feed on the chaos and uncertainty like some sort of, God or ghost from Ghostbusters, right? That's what happens. But let me give you some real examples, right? Let me give you some real examples of things that are anti-fragile. Because you might go, well, I get this, Shannon, but what? Huh? So let me give you an example. Let's look about Netflix, right? So Netflix. We all know Netflix. Some of you probably got Netflix, right? So, of course, what you may or may not know was that Netflix used to be a DVD rental service up until, well, let's be honest, people started streaming media for free, often breaking the law in the process of doing so, right? So their business could have sunk because they were providing a service that people were able to access for free. Right? Now, people could have stopped just using Netflix. Like, why am I going to use Netflix? I can do this for free. But unlike their competitors at the time, because there were competitors, there were other online streaming businesses, Netflix actually embraced the change. The thing that could have killed them, what they actually did was work out how to get clever about streaming. Let's work out what streaming is about, and they became almost what they feared the most, right? And became what they are today. Let me give you another example, a close example, and some of you may know of this organisation. Right. Stage Kings. Now, again, perhaps you've heard of them. This is a company that Sydney-based company started by Jeremy and Tabitha Fleming back in 2015. Now, Stage King existed to make custom stage sets for concerts, TV shows, plays, and the like. Right. All those types of things that aren't happening right now. Not too many concerts, plays, and stage shows are happening right now. So, as a result of COVID, they moved into making work-from-home furniture. Desks, stools, computer stands, footstools, all kinds of crazy stuff. In fact, my background that I've got here today, looks ace, huh? It's from Stage Kings, right? Anyway, this business is going gangbusters right now, absolutely off the charts. Their business is growing and expanding because of COVID. So this is a business that has moved beyond resilience. They haven't just maintained the status quo, they're actually growing as a result of COVID. Now, who knows what their business is going to look like in the future, right? Who knows what they're going to be turning to in the future? But right now, they're a wonderful example of an anti-fragile business, right? And then we've got another example, right? So Charlie Carrington is the head chef and owner of a restaurant here in Melbourne called Atlas Dining Room. So you can imagine when the government started imposing restrictions back in March on restaurants, closing restaurants down, etc. The hospitality industry went into disarray, and here in Melbourne it's still very much in disarray. And within the first 2 weeks, one of the first things that Atlas Dining Room did and Adam did was started to offer home delivered services where people could get the ingredients and then sign onto a YouTube channel and have a cooking tutorial to see how to cook their favourite Atlas Dining Room meal at home. So the meal kit arrived, log on, cook it at home, all the rest of it. So what the amazing thing about this is that this business, within the first 2 weeks of doing it so, had seen its most lucrative days on record. And in fact, since that time, this business is now going better than ever before. better than what it was pre-COVID. This is another example of a business who hasn't just responded, but has become anti-fragile and become better. And irrespective, even when the restaurant opens, this part of the business, cook from home, is going to stay. Another example of an anti-fragile business. So let's just do a quick recap of where we're at. Now I'm going to talk to you about some of these mindset things, right? This graph here, this kind of shows what happens when there's a business, and you'll notice on the left-hand side, we're all at the same place. And then something happens, right? An event happens, a disruptive event happens, a bit of a breaking point. And you'll notice what happens is that the fragile break and die off, right? Get blown out like the candle, because we were too big to change. We were overly optimized. There was no wriggle room, etc., right? Too slow. The resilient deal with it using, if we think about this from a personal level, the resilient deal with it and bounce back and get back to where they were, a pretty good position. Whereas the anti-fragile use this opportunity to sort of take a bit of a dip, but then grow and emerge out the other side, right, and become something even bigger. So the question that we get to here, of course, is how do we turn ourselves and how do we turn our businesses into something that's not only resilient, but capable of regenerating and evolving and becoming anti-fragile? And what I want to do, just looked at the time. I can't believe that we're almost out of time. So I'm going to go through these 5 actions that we can take, right? Because I think this is an interesting concept, right? Interesting concept to think about. And if you've tried to read Nassim's book, it almost takes you about 2 or 3 reads to get your head around it. And we're trying to do it in a 1-hour webinar. So how do we do it? What we're really talking about here is creating those businesses and leaders that can transform themselves and come out the other side bigger and better, move beyond resilience into anti-fragility. Now, what I'm going to do is just focus on 5 sort of keys that we can use. Now, in Nassim's book, there's heaps more. There's a stack more. But I've selected these 5 because I think they're the most actionable things and they're most consistent with what we're about here at IML and some of the other key themes that you've heard about today. And I think, it's been said a few times today that people think that after the pandemic, things are going to go back to normal, that we'll go back to doing things like we did before. But we know that's not the case. We get that, and we're seeing more and more evidence that that's not going to happen. In fact, we're going to enter a state of new normal. So I think everyone's going to have to be anti-fragile to be able to cope with that, simply because we're not going to return to that place of stability or that place of, equilibrium where we were before. Particularly because the business of the future is still being built right now, business like Stage King and Atlas Dining Room. Anyway, let's have a look at these principles. The first one, stick to simple rules, right? Here's what happens. Complex systems do not require complicated rules. I say this to some of the participants in my programs, like, what are you talking about? Complex systems do not need complicated rules. Your business, the symbols, the better. And I think as we become more anti-fragile or develop anti-fragile cultures is to resist the temptation to respond to the complexity and the change uncertainty that's going on right now, to implement more rules and processes and more bureaucracy. Because of course what happens is that produces a whole stack of other unintended consequences. And Taylor talks a lot about having simple rules, having just rules of thumb for people that allow them to make decisions quickly that in the long term help you become more agile and put you ahead, right? And he's got I might even find it, we'll send it to you in the resource pack. He's got a website of some of his rules of thumb, some of his heuristics that he uses, and he's always sort of adding to them. Right. But here's the thing, I think that at the end of the day, what you want to think about is what can I do to reduce the complexity for my people? How can I help them make good decisions right now, particularly if they're working remotely or in this blended place and they're sitting there going, I don't know what to do, so I've got to email the boss and then wait for a response. A customer rings up and a customer's got a complaint, but I don't know what to do. I used to be able to just put the phone call through to someone else or walk over to that person's desk and ask them. I can't do that from my kitchen bench. So I'll have to tell the customer that I've got to get back, right? Because I don't know what to do. How can we have some simple rules and processes? And some of the biggest businesses in the world, business like Atlassian, for example, even Netflix, Zappos, have really simple rules, complex organizations with simple rules that allow them to emerge from these type of circumstances bigger and better than ever before. Right, business like Stage Kings, really simple rules, whether it's solving customer issues, product quality issues, developing ideas, really simple rules that allow people to move really, really quickly. So the question for you is, what are you doing to create simple rules for your people to work by right now? Are you adding to the complexity by adding new rules? Are there new policies and processes in place because of what's happening, or reducing those? Second one, don't get overwhelmed by the data. And I think this is really important. In the context of this epidemic, a lot of people are reading lots of news, consuming lots and lots of data from lots and lots of different sources. And what happens is that we don't actually become judicial and discerning about what's actually noise and what's actually a useful signal for us. So I think that one of the things that we want to do is look at the data that we're looking at all this information and saying, right, here's some examples. Is this relevant? Is this not? Is all of this necessary? Right? What's the context of this data, et cetera, et cetera? Don't just take data on face value. You could argue that the Victorian government has done that to a degree, and they're micromanaging us into, an economic despair, right? And that's what happens. Sometimes we rely too much on the data, and we create patterns for pattern's sake. Data is useful, but only if you're focusing on the signals, not the noise. Lots of noise out there, but what are the most important signals for you? Because if you're consuming it all, you're so far from being anti-fragility. It's not funny. The next one is to experiment and iterate. Now, this is really linked into the reality of what life is here at IML, right? We've been doing this for years in our own programs. We think that it's important to be in this sort of perpetual motion, constantly moving, constantly evolving, looking at our offers, looking at our programs, looking at the syllabus of our programs and our approach, and working out how do we keep evolving? What's the little experiments that we can do? How do we reiterate with that program? We're trying to grow with each change and each evolution that happens in response to people like you and what our members tell us. And we know that it's essential to take small risks. When we have an idea here at IML, we test it on a small scale. We don't expect everything to work perfectly all of the time, right? And we manage that risk prudently. We're not sort of renegades and misfits here, but we try to change things, right? And then we change it again, and we try again, right? And we allow things to evolve, because that helps us, of course, deal with the unpredictability. Because we're already in a state of flux. We're already in a state of experimentation. We're used to having to deal with that. So when things change, it's like, we just got to tinker again, right? So, and what we also do, and what helps us develop that, is that both our failures and successes give us information. It doesn't always work, but when things doesn't work, we look back, right? And we say, okay, let's get introspective. Why didn't that work? How do we kind of exploit that? How do we log some lessons from that? We're embarrassed by it, of course, but we take lessons from that, right? And I like this quote from Taleb. He says that someone who's made plenty of errors, right, though never the same error more than once, I'm just reading this, is more reliable than someone who's never made any. I love that, right? And I think that for me, one of my personal little mantras is the avoidance of small mistakes makes the large ones even more severe. So are you allowing your people to experiment and iterate right now? Are you allowing them to try new things? Number 4, and this is linked with the previous principle, is about focus on avoiding what doesn't work. Here's the thing, right? As leaders, we're always focused on looking for solutions, trying to solve problems and knowing exactly what we have to do to make something work. However, sometimes that answer doesn't exist, right? The answer doesn't exist, right? There's no one single solution, or the answer is sort of utopian. But what we sometimes have to do is flip it around a little bit, and let's have a look at what's not working. And then if we focus on what's not working and eliminate what's not working, perhaps we can arrive at our destination faster. Let's exclude or get rid of what hinders us, what delays us, what prevents us from doing the things that we want to do, right? It's kind of like the fail fast. We hear a lot about fail fast. That's kind of what we're talking about here. I'll give you some examples, right? We often think, if you want to have better health, we've spoken a lot about that today, then quitting smoking is pretty good, and it's probably going to do you more good than starting to eat better food, right? Taking something out that's causing you issues is going to have a better impact than eating organically, right? If you want to get really, really wealthy, one of the first things you want to do is decrease your debt. Right? If you want to focus more and be more productive, then reduce your distractions. Right? When I'm feeling unmotivated, I know that I need to get rid of some of the things that are stopping me. I don't need to add more things into my life, right? So this is one of the things. What's holding you back? What's not working? And what can you get rid of, right? Focus on what's not working. Focus on the stuff that's hindering you. Had a client long story, but I had a client and they're working on a list for me, looking at all the things that aren't working. And then we're trying to work out, how do we get rid of those things? How do we simplify those things? Rather than adding things with this fool's philosophy that adding things is going to make people's life simpler and make the business more efficient. It's not. And finally, resist the urge to suppress randomness. Randomness happens, and it happens all of the time. Be open to it, understand that it works that way, and then embrace it. Learn to live in the now and have a bit of an eye to the future from a possibility perspective rather than an absolute perspective, because things happen. It rains even when the weather person says that it's going to be sunny. You can get a phone call that just creates your havoc in your day. Everything was going beautifully until that phone call happens. The project may have presented a problem or an opportunity that no one possibly could have predicted. These things happen all of the time. Don't be paralyzed when this happens. The first question you want to ask is, how do we deal with it and how do we move forward? Rather than trying to create this kind of bubble of certainty, like a soccer mum, you know, or dad, kind of micromanaging their kid, that doesn't work. So let's embrace it and work out how to deal with it. I think that the challenge is when we artificially suppress volatility, what happens is that when trouble does strike, it's much more difficult to deal with. Again, a bit like, you know, resiliency with kids, right? We talk about resilience with kids, but often we're trying to create anti-fragile kids. Kids who learn to deal with stuff and grow as a result of some of the impact that they have or some of the falls that they have throughout life. Right? Trying to seek stability in this current environment is a sucker's game. Don't get looked in. Oh, right, so summary. I'm super conscious of the time. I clearly bitten off more than I can chew today, Sam. Sorry about that, but here's a quick summary. Summary for you. Black swans, grey rhinos. Think about future possibilities, and those two give us a bit of a framework. But understand that it's not about predicting the future. It's about understanding different scenarios and possibilities, not about predicting the future with any level of certainty, because it's an illusion. And then finally, when it comes to developing an anti-fragile mindset, there's 5 really quick ideas that you can start to think about to implement within yourself and within your business to help you become more anti-fragile. Over to you, Sam. I got there right on time. I don't know what that means for Q&A, but you'll work that out.
Yes, no, thank you. We're right on time, Shannon. Slightly over, but I thought I was so intrigued by the presentation, I lost track of time too. But it was terrific. Thank you so much for an excellent presentation. We've probably got time for maybe 1 or 2 questions because we never like to leave people hanging. Sure. Just a quick one. So I think Lisa just wrote in and said, "Sorry, I missed what number 3 was." And it was experiment and iterate, was it? Was that I think that was number 3. Yeah. So just to answer your question. There was a couple of funny comments early on in the session, Shannon. Phil Kingsman, for any rugby league supporters, the Black Swan event of 2020, the Brisbane Broncos finishing the bottom of the ladder. Okay, so with a serious question, Elizabeth's asked, is anti-fragility only personal, or can you embed anti-fragility as a culturally within the organisation?
Yes, yes, you can implement it in organisations, and this is a lot of my work at the moment. A lot of our work at IML, all of the speakers that you've heard today. Absolutely. How do we create, and even those 5 steps, you know, as leaders, how do we role model those behaviours to create anti-fragile cultures, anti-fragile organisations, those that aren't just the phoenix that rises from the ashes in the same state, that come back bigger and stronger? So the short answer is yes.
Okay, thank you, Shannon. Annie, how do I get my staff to think this?
I think it's a good question. How do we get our staff doing this? And again, it's a similar theme to similar questions throughout the day. I think one of the first things is just start talking about it. Start talking about it. You know, these are the replays of these webinars from today are going to be made available to you all. The resources, the additional articles, videos, etc., that each of us have supplied with you. I think just start talking about it, and then just pick one thing. Like, I think from the mindset, the 5 that we looked at, you might say, well, let's just pick one thing. And that's exactly what I've done with a client recently. We've got in our Accelerate program, so part of our Accelerate program, they're working on a project. And one of the projects one of our clients is working on is developing an anti-fragile culture within their team. And we use those 5 mindsets, and they're just focusing on one. And that one is all about experimentation and iteration. So it's about socialising the context, having some conversations about it, and then picking a place to start.
Thanks, Shannon. I think I've just seen the time and I've got the wind up from Libby, so I'm sorry we can't get to some of the questions. There is about 15 comments here saying, great presentation, excellent presentation, really made me think, very engaging, an amazing day. So Shannon, thank you so much for that terrific presentation, and any questions that we haven't got to, we will endeavour to work with Shannon on getting those answered.
My pleasure, Sam.
Thank you very much. And look, I do want to extend a thank you, this being the last session of today's Virtual Development Day. I want to thank the facilitators first and foremost, Nikki, Ty, Matt and Shannon, gone over and above to present wonderful content delivered in your own unique styles. So it's been hugely rewarding to be watching it, and I know that all of our participants today have got an enormous amount out of it. So thank you to all of our facilitators. I'd also like to thank the team in behind all of this. Joe, Libby, I know Sophie's been on the social media, but lots of people that have brought this together and brought the content, brought the facilitators and pulled the day together, particularly Joe and Libby in the background, answering all the questions, making sure the technical issues are solved. So thank you very much to them. To remind everyone, all the recordings will be sent to you. I hope tonight, if not tomorrow morning at the latest, once we get all the recordings packaged up and sent. So you'll be able to reflect on all of these learnings and use and reflect on your action plans. Use your action plans, reflect on those, go back to it. And one final, I guess, push from me at IML is that we offer a range of services for managers and leaders, both from a learning and development standpoint and a networking, connection and mentoring standpoint. We'd love you to be a part of our community. We'd love it if you wanted to share your expertise with us and bring that to the fore and learn from our development opportunities. Please get in touch with us, info@managersandleaders.com.au. I know we've got in October an Essentials program, a Foundations program and an Accelerate program running. So there's leadership programs that are ready to go in October. So please inquire through info@managersandleaders.com.au. We'd love to have you on board with facilitators like Shannon Cooper and Matt and Nikki and Ty. Terrific experience, terrific learning. Thank you so much on behalf of IML. And like I said, if you've got any inquiries, please let us know. But wonderful day, and thanks to the team, and thanks for the participants for being a part of it, and certainly asking wonderful questions. We'll see you all soon. So have a great evening. Thank you.